Thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much for your patience while I got all of this together, fat-fingering things and not knowing how things work. I appreciate you attending. Let's go ahead and get started. So, thank you all so much for joining my presentation entitled, Keeping Your Open Source Projects Accessible to All. This is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. As you know, being who I am, involved in open source, I would not be here if it were not for the allies and for the support and mentorship that I received in the open source community. So this is my very small way of giving back, and I am so thankful and so grateful that each and every one of you took time out of your day to come to this presentation. And I'm also especially grateful to Alex Miller and all for the invite. So thank you all so much. And now that we've got that obligatory SAP out of the way, of which I meant every single word, let's go ahead and get started. Howdy, strangers. I'm sorry, I love a good pun. So I had to go ahead and throw that in there. Punning is kind of what I get paid to do, so I have to wedge them in whenever I can. You're probably wondering who I am, how I managed to get a dog in here. So, my name is Treva Williams, and I am Community Manager / Dev Advocate, I always want to say avocado, for Replicated. Pretty much what my job is to create engagement with open source projects and also come up with funny names for things. If you're going to KubeCon, either virtually or in person, you'll see those random silly things all around, and more likely than not, it was probably me that named it, like cube sticks. So before I started Replicated, I happened to get hired at this company called Rackspace, where I was introduced to this thing called OpenStack, and that got me involved with open source, and the rest is history. That's how I ended up here. The more interesting, my co-presenter here is Sir Harold B. Goggington III, otherwise known as Goggy, and he is currently Chief Cuddle Officer for Pink Penguins. He's an 8-year-old Shih Tzu and also my emotional support animal. And he also works as kind of an unofficial support animal at all of the conferences that we go to. So if you feel overwhelmed or you need to take a break or just need like a hug or something like that from someone that's not a person and you see us around, feel free to stop us. Goggy loves comforting people, so we're available if you need support. Now, before I get into the meat and potatoes, I have to do an obligatory plug for the ones what brung me. My company is called Replicated, and it is a company that is founded by and currently run by some amazing people who go out of their way to create truly diverse and accommodating environments for all of us, which is why I'm able to travel with my support dog. And I mean, being mostly fully remote doesn't hurt either, but they really do an excellent job of making sure that everyone feels represented and that everyone feels seen. And I'm very grateful and appreciative of the opportunity to work for such an amazing company. All right, so let's talk about what we're actually here to do. Or actually, I have one more slide I have to talk about what it is that I do at Replicated. I manage not 1, not 2, but 7 open source projects that I couldn't even fit all the logos for on this page. Or actually, I might manage 8. I've kind of lost count by now. But basically, they pay me to geek out about things like troubleshoot, TTL, outdated, all that kind of stuff like that. By the way, if you have a few minutes, check out outdated.sh. That website is to die for, meaning layout, of course, because that's how I think about things. All right. So we're here because we want more diversity in our open source projects. We want more participation from people of color. We want more participation from women. We want more participation from non-binary people and from differently abled people. Now, I've got a few suggestions on how that can happen, but before I do that, before I jump into that, I've got to throw some numbers at you just to make this look more professional, not like I'm just standing up here showing off my outfit. So, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, about 22% of professional programmers are female, 34% identify as Black, Asian, or Latino, and about 16% self-identify as members of ethnic minorities or ethnic groups. So, those numbers aren't great, but I mean, when you compare it to US demographics in general, it seems like right around what you would expect. And you would also expect that contributor diversity would match that. Well, unfortunately, it does not. So back in 2017, GitHub did a survey called the Open Source Survey, where they surveyed a total of 5,500 randomly selected people on some random questions, and they also included questions about demographic information. Out of all of the respondents, all 5,500, 95% identified as male. Only 3% identified as female, and 1% identified as non-binary. Which is interesting because most open source contributions happen on the job. So what is making it to where male programmers and developers are willing to contribute to open source more than their female, non-white counterparts? Seriously, what the heck is going on? Now, I don't think this is part of some grand conspiracy to exclude people that are non-white cishet males. But clearly, something's discouraging those people from participating in the, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Something is discouraging non-white cishet males from participating in open source. Fortunately, that GitHub survey included a section where people could respond and give some of the reasons why they felt like they didn't want to be participants in open source. So the most responded was incomplete or confusing documentation. Next was unresponsiveness or dismissive responses to attempted contribution. Third was conflict. Fourth, unexplained rejection. And fifth, unwelcoming language or content. Sorry, I skipped ahead too fast. Now, while you can't do a whole lot to prevent any type of personality conflict, because, I mean, if someone just happens to start a conversation about whether or not people prefer DC over Marvell, and the ones who prefer DC start an argument because, of course, they're wrong, so they have to defend their point, you can't really do a whole lot about that. But what you do have full control over is whether or not you respond to those PRs promptly, whether or not you respond politely, and also whether or not you update your dadgum docs. Seriously, update your documentation. There is no greater and more annoying deterrent to getting involved with an open source project than trying to read through the documentation, and it looks like someone cut out a bunch of words having to do vaguely with the project, put them in a jar, shook that jar around, dumped it out on the floor, and wrote out whatever the resulting jumble was. Update your documentation. And when you can, keep it simple. One of my favorite quotes by Albert Einstein is, and I'm going to paraphrase because I'm reading this, because I'm doing this by memory, if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, then you don't fully understand it yourself. Now that's pretty harsh, but there's a time and a place for the SAT words. And also you have to remember that not only is there a large population in our field that don't have computer science and engineering degrees, but there are also a lot of us who speak English as a second language. And also, folks are getting started younger and younger these days, so they may not have even had the opportunity to decide not to take on all that debt to go to school for computer science or engineering. So keep those people in mind. Seriously, I can't drive this point enough. Update your documentation. And while you're at it, don't assume the knowledge level of your audience. A lot of times we skip over documenting a specific step or a series of steps because we do them so frequently that it's just kind of second nature. To avoid that, a good suggestion that I heard yesterday, as a matter of fact, is to have someone totally unfamiliar with your project look over your documentation, because they're going to ask the questions that the noobs might ask. And as I said previously, keep it simple when you can. There is no reason for a quick start to read like quantum physics. Another thing that I am personally a fan of is glossaries. If you can, include a glossary along with your project documentation. OpenStack, got a wedge and a mention for them again. They have a robust, very active, dedicated, and incredible community, a very diverse community, mostly because they have outstanding documentation. They've managed to grow from 5 small projects to dozens of community contributed projects that are the basis for a whole lot of cloud platforms that you use today, because they have excellent documentation. And by the way, if you got some time, jump on over to openstack.org and you'll see what I'm talking about. Not every project has great docs, cough, cough, triple O, but some of them are phenomenal. Another reason why you want to include a glossary is because there are some terms and phrases related to your project that are kind of hard to Google. Like, Google will lead you completely in the wrong direction, especially when you're a baby admin trying to figure out how something works. So it's better to not leave it up to chance and go ahead and define it yourself. And speaking of those baby admins, it's very important to have mentorship programs. Instead of rejecting those bad PRs, link up with that person instead, if time permits, of course. While it takes extra time, it's always better to foster a newly but dedicated admin in completing their contribution than to just throw it to the side and discourage them. That's how we lose contributors across the board, not just people of color, not just other underrepresented groups. And speaking of underrepresented groups, don't forget about the differently abled. I'm not sure if my GIF is playing, but this is a demonstration of a plugin on a website by a company called Userway, I believe. And in addition to providing accessibility options that adjust contrast, whether or not GIFs or videos play, text size, etc., there's also a dyslexia-friendly font that I was absolutely amazed to look at because I hadn't even realized how hard I was straining to follow along with words on a screen until I didn't have to strain so much to look at them. So just a small thing like adding a WordPress plugin to your website and to your documentation can make a huge difference, if it's nothing more than making the differently abled community feel seen. So I'm talking a lot in generalities, but we're here because we want more diversity. The overall message is build it, they'll come. What we all want is more engagement and more interaction in general, right? Right. So if you have excellent documentation, if you have great accessibility options, if you have a really friendly, really robust mentor program, if you respond to those PRs or at least have an outline setting proper expectations for when a PR can be responded to, contributors will come, and they'll come from all communities, all backgrounds. But when they get there, don't be weird. Like, please, don't be weird about it. And to give an example of what I mean, like, don't prop up the one woman whose name you know on International Women's Day and then forget about women the rest of the year. Instead, celebrate people who are non-white cishet males simply because they did something great. It makes a difference. It's really obvious when you try to tokenize, and also it's really honorable when you don't. We're not asking for special treatment. We're just asking to be included. Not to mention, seeing representation for a person who feels like they can't do the thing because of where they come from, what their background is, or what their education level is, seeing themselves represented is encouragement to get involved themselves. It was certainly an encouragement for me because I'm actually a high school dropout. I dropped out in 9th grade. Now, granted, I put myself through college, but seeing other people who came from similar struggles is what encouraged me to at least try. So representation matters, just don't be weird about it. Also, hammering this again, be responsive when you can. And if you can't respond, because I totally understand what it's like to have to work a full-time job and try to manage one or several projects by yourself. There's just not enough hours in the day. If you're not capable of cloning yourself, which I mean, shame on you if you can't, like the technology totally doesn't exist, but you should be able to do it anyway. Like I mentioned earlier, Write an outline to set proper expectations for when a response can be expected, which I guess goes back to my previous point that I keep on bringing up. Update your documentation. And while you're at it, update that Readme. Nothing is more irksome to me, personally, than going to a GitHub repo and seeing a Readme that has nothing but lorem ipsum, or even worse, it has instructions for how to deploy that are 5 years old in conflict with what's on the primary docs on the website, just enough to where when you try to launch it one way, it completely breaks. When you try to do it the updated way, it's still broken. So you end up in this cycle of frustration and you can't find anything, and you end up just kind of throwing the project to the side because screw this. Update your Readme, please. When you push major updates, include at least a note in the Readme about them. Update your Readme. This is the point that I already mentioned. Don't reject without reason. Now, this isn't something that I've seen happen in the wild, I don't think, ever. Maybe once or twice. But I just wanted to include this point anyway because it gives me an excuse to use one of my favorite GIFs. And also to talk about one of my colleagues who did something incredible. So his name is John Murphy. You have to say the whole thing every time. We had a huge pull request come in for one of our open source projects. I'm talking pages long. That was super ambitious, very creative, really added a lot of features potentially, but there were a few things that were wrong. Well, my colleague John Murphy spent an entire month meticulously combing through this pull request, and instead of rejecting it, because we had many conversations about it, he left notes on every single thing that needed to be changed, every single thing that needed to be improved, every single thing that we could or couldn't add, and how to fix it, and actually ended up volunteering to mentor this person. And I thought that was very moving, because in him doing that, we have gained a loyal community member and may have also gained a new engineer, because that person is now interviewing for our engineering team at Replicated. So, had to throw in a little kudos for John Murphy. I hope he sees this. Thank you so much for being so dedicated. And while I know I keep saying time doesn't permit us to do those types of things all the time, when you can, do it. It makes a huge difference. So I'm sort of coming up on my close. Our diversity is our power. There have been several studies made showing that companies in the tech community that have diverse hires, they generally innovate faster and they generate more money than more homogeneous, cis-het, white male populated, that's a weird way to phrase that, than companies that have mainly cis-het, white male employees. So there's no reason to believe that the same type of innovation couldn't happen with more diverse contributions coming in. And going back to OpenStack once again, because they're the ones what brung me, they're an excellent example of what happens when you have a massive and diverse community contributing and showing and demonstrating their skill sets. That's a weird way to phrase that, but I'm going to leave it alone. So yes, diversity is important, and it certainly pays off. It pays off actually fairly quickly. So I guess that's all I got. I'm sure I had more written out, but I've kind of forgotten it now. So I'm going to go ahead and take any questions. Questions? Yes?
You've been clear that OpenStack is a good example. Do you have specific places within, projects within to look at for good examples of documentation?
Yes. Specific projects to look at would be OpenStack Heat. That is, I think, CloudFormation on AWS. Another one will be OpenStack Glance. And Swift has fantastic documentation also. There's a quarterly contributor list that's released. If we ping me later, I'll give you a bit more information, but those are the 3 projects I can think of off the top of my head that have excellent examples of what I'm talking about. Sure. Any other questions? Yes.
So one of the problems with documentation largely is that we're kind of blind to it because we already know about the project. One of the ways that we try to get around that is when you're onboarding a new hire who has a lot of the same context. You hand them the documentation, let them run with it. How do you get someone without that context to beta test the documentation so that you can address the lack of shared context?
That is an excellent question that I'm not sure that I have an adequate answer for. I don't want to stand up here looking stupid, so ping me afterwards and we'll talk about it. Got to take a second to think about it. Any further questions that I may or may not be able to answer offhand? All right. Okay. All right, well, thank you so much for coming. I just wanted an excuse to wedge in some blue here because it's my favorite color. If you do have any further questions, I do have a little Slack channel on the Strange Loop 2021 Slack, and it is that really long hyphenated thing there at the bottom. I'll leave this up so that you can take screenshots and everything. But if you have any questions about this presentation, if you'd like to read or see what I actually wrote out versus what I've been rambling about, I will happily send that to you. Or if you have any questions in general that I can help you with, or you just want to know where Gaugy and I are, ping me on there. If you want to see where I got my numbers from, that is on the Bureau of Labor Statistics website. And also there's a link to userway.org, which is where that plugin that I kind of stand for comes from. And if you're anywhere out in the future and you want to know more about replicated open source, or you want to find me for some other reason, I pretty much live on replicated.com/OSS. So with that, that is pretty much all I got. Thank you all so much again. I apologize for the rambling and scrambly brain, but I appreciate you being here. Thank you so much, and I hope that you have a great rest of your conference. Thank you.